pray. Saturday he told me what to say. Sunday gave me the power divine. I'll let my little light shine. Oh, this little light of mine, Lord, I'm gonna let it shine. All in Mississippi, I'm gonna let it shine.
We present This Little Light, Part 12 of a series of programs on Mississippi in 1964.
I have come now to the end of this series of programs, which I hope has helped to tell the story of Mississippi in the summer of 1964. I went to Mississippi as a reporter, convinced, as I recall it now, that the story I would find would be a story of young people assaulting the walls of segregation. I thought that the white population of the state would be uniformly callous and hostile. I thought that the black population would be largely indifferent, and so dispossessed that it would be almost unable to move. The reality that I found in Mississippi did not conform with this image, and I hope that these programs have not reflected any such reality. Perhaps it is not necessary to say these things, but I cannot help but feel that the involvement one gets in covering a story of this kind requires some kind of comment. I found in Mississippi that the real story was not the story of those who came into the South, but those who have always lived and worked there, both black and white. I do not mean to discount the movement. I only mean to emphasize that the movement is basically a movement of Mississippians. It is the story of the citizens of Valley View, of Harmony, of Emmett County, of Greenwood, Jackson, Chunky, Liberty, Lexington, Jackson, Carthage, and Bourbon. This series has dealt almost exclusively with black Mississippians. There are reasons for this, some of which should be evident. But I cannot close this series and leave the impression that whites are totally silent, totally unconcerned and unaware. I spoke with many whites in Mississippi, and while I had my share of hostility from them, I also had a measure of kindness and concern, of honesty. I found those deeply concerned with Mississippi and what would happen to her now. There is a debate in Mississippi today, a debate on where the state goes from here, and whites are taking place in this debate no less than blacks. For there is a real question. Where does Mississippi go from here? Those who have not sought for a solution to the racial situation, those who think in terms only of resistance, of maintaining a way of life that is increasingly unviable, see Mississippi as a savior of America, believe that Mississippi is the greatest state and the greatest nation. Their rhetoric was still dominant in the fall and winter following the summer of 1964. It was the rhetoric of state fairs and political campaigns.
My friends, I've lived to see in the last few years things that I never dreamed that I'd see if I lived to be an old man. I say to you, my friends, don't give up the ship. Mississippi's got everything to be proud for. You ought to see my mail. You ought to see my mail. Yes, when I made the little speech and they picked something out they thought it'd be detrimental, they put it on television and everybody flowed in with the mail. I don't say we got a majority of the people in these northern states, but I say to you, my friend, we have a great number more than we had a few years ago. Yes, Governor Barnett, the Sovereignty Commission of Mississippi, thank God they went into the north and into other states and they laid the foundation and they set the predicate. Then for George Wallace, who has made one of the greatest contributions of any one man in America, and I say his contribution and the group of Mississippi that went over this country had as much to do with helping to solidify conservative support in this country that helped Governor Senator Goldwater beat the living devil out of these New England liberals and left-wingers that should be in the left-wing element of the National Democratic Party. We are one of the most conservative delegations as a unit in the entire Congress of the United States. We are the greatest people on earth. Let's reunite our efforts. Let's solidify our determination. Let's go forward. Even with the tune of the NACP, we shall be free.
This rhetoric is not unchallenged by white Mississippians, although too frequently those who speak publicly are those who have left the state, at least temporarily. Professor James Silver opened the discussion last year with his book, The Closed Society, and as an historian, Silver traced Mississippi's development into a closed society from the 19th century.
shortly after the Kansas-Nebraska bill, which was passed in 1854, that there developed, or at least there was an acceleration of the development of this thing I call the closed society. The closed society, to me, simply means that there is what I call the orthodoxy, which almost everybody subscribes to. In Mississippi in the 1850s, it was slavery, and since then it has been white supremacy. It goes along with something else which Mississippians hold holy, that is state rights in politics, and then there is more than a dash of religious fundamentalism which bolsters this whole business. While everyone, or almost everyone in the state, agrees with this fundamentalist creed, it's true that there are dissenters, and the dissenters, the people who will not go along with the orthodoxy, are told to keep their mouths shut. And then if they do not keep their mouths shut voluntarily, they are suppressed in one way or the other, sometimes by force, and of course the ultimate thing is to run them out of the state. And the best case of that recently is the simple fact that some 80 to 85 young Methodist ministers have left the state of Mississippi in the last 6 or 7 years involuntarily.
The question of race seems at times to be not so much a cause as a tool to maintain an orthodoxy about a way of life that no longer exists. The topic of race dominates Mississippi. Former Senator Frank Smith told me,
well, as I attempt to point out in the book, it's eliminated any serious or intelligent discussion of virtually any other political issue. Race has become the issue that is all in all. And as a result, it's been impossible to make the type of analysis of personal qualifications of candidates or a proper analysis of their views and ideas about not only national and world problems, but even the specific day-to-day problems of the state government within Mississippi that have no great relationship to national and world problems. This having a satisfactory to the state political concept, viewpoint and position about race has become all important, especially in the years since World War II.
Both Frank Smith and James Silvers are Southerners and Mississippians. They have published on the subject of their state, and their position is clear. They were both also in the fortunate position of being relatively immune to pressure. And I say only relatively, because it is always courageous to speak the truth when it is possible to remain silent. But there were many others in the state to whom I spoke privately, who said what Silvers and Smith said, and who say that the state must change. They were afraid, however, to speak publicly, and with ample reason.
In most of the areas of the state, however, where any person of local prominence, be he lawyer, minister, or businessman, has been identified in opposition to the Citizens Council, or been identified in any way with any position that might be called in support of the civil rights movement, or sympathy with, for instance, with this campaign this past summer, well, this particular individual has suffered immediate reprisals in the way of personal abuse, in the way of immediate economic reprisals. For a minister, and most of them lose their churches. If it's difficult under the church rules or law to take them out of the church, it's not difficult at all to deny them their normal, to take away their salaries, which is an immediate way of reprisal. Lawyers would lose their normal practice. Businessmen lose their normal customers. They might find that their contracts are canceled, that their place of doing business can be taken away with them, and if there's anybody who's susceptible at all to any type of economic pressure, proceeds with the greatest of caution, and those who have become incautious have found that that economic pressure is very likely to be used against them.
There isn't any question about it. Right now in Jackson, people of goodwill do not do what they would ordinarily do for fear of the reprisals of one sort or another of the Citizens Council. One of the Citizens Council officers, in a speech made in South Carolina, which I mentioned in the book, he says without any question that there may come a time when the council will have to indulge in violence to reach its goals. And yet, outsiders ought to realize that a great many respectable people, bank presidents, doctors, lawyers, are officers high in the Citizens Council, and most of these people themselves would never think of engaging in violence, and yet I think their very conduct may lead other less responsible people to violence.
Mm-hmm. Yet while it can and must be said that this dialogue goes on in the homes of Mississippi whites, there are those in the state who are not waiting for the pressure to ease before they act. And these people are largely black. And if the whites are afraid of violence, the Negroes are experiencing it.
We organized, we began to get the peoples to come out and meet. That was in 1954. Well, since that time, we made tremendous progress. In Mid-County, we have one registered voter. I think that's doing fine for Mid-County. One registered voter.
The laconic character of E.W. Steptow is typical of those who are now acting in Mississippi to change that society. The reaction to their activities came swiftly in the summer of 1964.
The next day, the sheriff visited. When he walks in, I was sitting inside my home. He walks in with his hat on, with guns on his side, and says, "Steptow, I want to talk with you." I told him, I said, "Okay, Sheriff." I says, "Have a seat." He said, "No, I want to talk with you privately." I said, "No, Sheriff, I have had orders not to go out." Well, you know, I hadn't had no orders. But I was trying to save Steptow. But he insisted that I should walk out and talk with him. Well, you know, quite natural. Well, I give over, because he had his guns and his blackjacks, and I know what they're supposed to do to Negroes in the state of Mississippi. Well, I walks out, I gets about 10 feet from the porch. He says, "Steptow, don't you know you're going to get killed?" I said, "Yeah, Sheriff." I said, "I know that. I know my life is overdue." I said, "I know I'm supposed to have been killed." He said, "Well, Steptow, what would it profit you to lose your life in a case like this?" I said, "Well, it wouldn't mean nothing to me at my age to lose my life. And the children and the unborn generation will profit by me losing my life."
In Mr. Steptow's county, Amet County, there was what one would have to call a reign of terror which existed in that county for a period of 5 months. That is a reign of terror more unusual than that which exists in the counties of Mississippi and even in the Klan-dominated counties during most of the time. And it was a period in which Negroes Saturday night after Saturday night, and for some reason they choose Saturday night, were dragged out of their homes, taken into the countryside, and beaten by armed men. I mean, nobody knows about these beatings. It was a time when Negroes were being driven out of the county, often simply by word of mouth. I mean, you have to take, when a white man tells you to get out of the county in Amet County, you have to take his word for it. I mean, Mr. Lewis Allen, who was murdered in the end of January, was told to get out of the county, and he refused to listen, and he was murdered. And now when a white man tells a Negro in Amet County to get out of the county, he must get out of the county or else his life isn't worth anything. And so during these months, there were at least 10, I've counted, over 10 people who were driven out of the county in one way or another. For a while, there was a campaign to force Negroes who were working in Liberty to force their firing for no apparent reason. It was decided, the decision was made that no more Negroes were to live in the town of, to work in the town of Liberty. And so for a period of 2 or 3 months, there was a steady, persistent pressure on the merchants of the area to fire every single Negro who worked in the area. And you have to know what this means. You have to talk to these people and understand when you talk to them, because they live in Macomb, in New Orleans, in Baton Rouge, exiles from their home, what they mean when they tell you, I want to go back to my county, but I'm afraid I'm going to get killed. I had to get out. I had to leave my property, my home. Nobody's there to buy it. I can't sell it because the white people know that I can't come back. The Negroes are afraid to move in and buy it because they know what's happened. I mean, this is the kind of situation. We have flocks of exiles in these counties, in these towns, rather, outside of Amite County, in New Orleans, in Baton Rouge, and in Macomb. And this is, in fact, where I've been able to derive some of this information, living in Macomb. It must be remembered that there have been 7 murders in this area since December of 1963. 7 people have been murdered.
Getting to the book itself, you've titled it Mississippi, the Closed Society, and after reading it, and I suppose most anyone who has some first-hand knowledge of conditions in Mississippi, the closed society is itself something of a euphemism. One might even say a totalitarian society, because this is the elements you describe as defining the closed society in Mississippi are essentially totalitarian in nature, it seems to me, and one might even call them incipient fascism.
Well, there isn't any question about this, and I have used the expression totalitarian state. I don't know that I've ever used the term fascist, although I could easily have. On the other hand, in the book, I try to make it clear that this is not a completely closed and absolutely closed society. For instance, I talk a good deal in the book about the Jackson newspapers, but I also say that there are liberal papers in Mississippi, in Tupelo, and in Lexington, and in Greenville, and until recently in Pascagoula. And there are also liberals, I think they're liberals, in Mississippi in the fields of education, politics, and in the church. It is not a completely closed society.
Mm-hmm.
But where it is almost absolutely closed is, of course, in the field of racial relations.
And there's constant talking about it, as I indicate in my book. Perhaps it's, I'm sure there's some psychological explanation of the fact, but the Mississippians, and like so many other Southerners, but perhaps more than other Southerners, are constantly preoccupied with the race issue. And they constantly talk about it in some form. Relatively few people, though, feel that they can freely talk about it if their views about the race issue are a little bit different from what is considered the norm or the average. If their views in any way approach what might be called moderation, they are fearful to talk to, even quite often, to members of the family or people that normally would be their close friends.
It must also not be forgotten that the discussion that exists in Mississippi today is largely the result of the young people of SNCC and Acor, who decided to come into the state and who, through their programs, have focused attention on the state.
I recall that when the summer project was being discussed, there was a meeting in Greenville, Mississippi, and I happened to be there about a year ago, and Bob Moses, who now I think is well known as the SNCC and COFO leader in Mississippi, was talking about the tremendous responsibility of bringing all these people down, and told how he felt responsible for the fact that when they first began working in Mississippi, a Negro farmer named Herbert Lee was murdered. And he really grappled with this question. Do we have the right to do this? And he came to the conclusion, and I think everybody else in the room did, and the results show it, that these are risks that we take, and that in the long run, there'll be some pain and some people will die, but in the long run, the difference that this is going to make in the lives of thousands and millions of people is going to be worth it. Otherwise, without the risk, without the risk of pain and torture and even death, what has been an agony for millions of people and a sin for everybody else will persist, and that's worse.
Do you think that SNCC believes that it's going to be successful in a state like Mississippi?
If it didn't believe that it was going to be successful, I don't think it would be there.
How would it define terms of its success? In other words, what would be its criteria? What would success be?
It's already successful. This seems a strange thing to say when so few Negroes are being registered to vote, when people are getting beaten and when bombs are being thrown. They measure success in terms of people won over and people awakened. They measure success in terms of the membrane of a closed society being broken. And in that sense, it's a constant ongoing success, even in the midst of disaster, of death, of peril to their lives.
Mississippi is to some extent a microcosm of the rest of the nation. Not only are we all involved with each other, but the problems that Mississippi faces are problems that we face elsewhere, albeit exacerbated by racial tension. For years, the labor of the Mississippi Negro was necessary for the production and distribution of cotton, and there were good sound reasons to keep his wages low, to put him at an unfair advantage with the white farmer. But now in the fields of the Delta and in the hills, the Negro laborer is increasingly becoming unnecessary, as the great mechanical cotton choppers and pickers move down the long, neat, fertilized rows. The figures are graphic. Today, 15 man-hours are needed to produce a bale of cotton. 30 years ago, 150 hours of hard, manual labor were needed. 10 times fewer man-hours of work per bale today. And of course, as mechanized production is only profitable on large farms, the small farmer sells out, or is squeezed out, and moves north to Chicago, Philadelphia, or New York. But in the summer of 1964, there were few jobs in the north for the expatriate Mississippi day laborer or farmer, and slowly they came hitchhiking back from the big cities, back to Mississippi, where no jobs waited either. At the general stores, where the farm trucks come at dawn to pick up the laborers, there are always too many people waiting to be taken to the fields.
Is it too many people because there isn't transportation to get them out there, or is it because the planter doesn't want that many people?
The planter doesn't want that many people.
Mm-hmm. Why not?
Because he's putting on what they call it, pre-mud to kill the grass, and he don't need the Negro labor, sir. And then too, they're building cotton chop machine. Yeah, I chopped in the field one this year. It was chopping just as good as I was up there. Matter of fact, it chopped better than I was because it didn't stop. And that's another thing.
It didn't drink water.
It didn't drink water. It didn't drink water. And it didn't go to the bushes.
Now, what's going to happen to people, or what is happening to people who no longer can go out and chop cotton? How are they living?
Most of them that is not going, you would say it's old people, and they're drawing old
Social Security.
Yeah.
The circle represented by this dilemma quickly becomes a vicious one. The Negro no longer has work on the farms. The civil rights movement continues to pressure the state to make changes in the structure to include the Negro as a citizen. But part of citizenship in America in the mid-century is the right to work and earn a living, and even without the pressure of an increasingly automated society, so long as the state resists the civil rights movement with force, so long as Mississippi is projected on the nation's screen as an area of lawlessness and chaos, just so long will the industry necessary to provide jobs remain outside of the state's borders. During the summer of 1964, there were few indications that Mississippi would change her pattern of response to the struggle for racial justice, and many Mississippians I talked with, white and black, felt that only the federal government could make the state change its posture toward the Negro people.
Do you think that perhaps that there's just an outside chance that there are enough liberal or moderate, to use that strange word, people in Mississippi to make a significant force if they were adequately organized and adequately courageous?
No, I do not. Of course, I think in terms of the people I know at the university, and so many of these people have gotten so disgusted with the present situation that they've just picked up and left. And this is true to a lesser extent, I think, throughout the state. No, there is no real possibility of change from moderate leadership in the foreseeable future. But there is some moderate leadership, and there is this outside pressure which is going to be insurmountable, it seems to me.
They, in the latter years, in the past few years, I think more and more, they spoke up with a concept that only if this burden could be lifted from us. In other words, only if there were national civil rights laws that would define a pattern for the elimination of official segregation and discrimination and so forth. And with that in effect, perhaps that would be the only way to bring a solution to a state like Mississippi, where there never would be a way to break down all the barriers that that would normally work for voluntary elimination of segregation.
During the fall and winter following the summer of 1964, there were indications that white Mississippians themselves were beginning to struggle to their feet and strive to deal with their own racial problem. A group of young Southern students, largely white, established an organization on college campuses throughout the South and at least had positive contact with students in Mississippi. A biracial committee was formed to help rebuild Negro churches destroyed by the arson of rampant segregationists. A committee sprang into existence to help preserve the public school system, which for a moment it seemed might be closed rather than integrate. And in the winter, business groups and Chamber of Commerces in various parts of the state issued statements calling for law and order and resistance only through legal constitutional means. But however change is eventually to come, and of course some change will come, whether through federal intervention or through the state's own will, change for what? Change to what? What is the image that Mississippi is to emulate? Chicago? Philadelphia? Los Angeles? Harlem? Where is the model in America of a racially integrated and healthy social setting? What are we Northerners to tell our Southern citizens?
Well, what happens when we've got Mississippi like New York? What happens when we've got Alabama like Chicago? Where are we then? Mm-hmm. And I think perhaps this is the most crucial issue now before the civil rights movement. Is it going to think beyond desegregation? Is it going to think now in terms of more fundamental changes in American society? In this regard, I think SNCC has something to offer, because I think the young people in SNCC, even though they're not clear about this, they don't really have a program which is set and definite and worked out, but they have a vision of doing much more than desegregating society. They're opposed to the cult of success, of living in neat houses and living a middle-class existence and not caring about the other fellow. They're opposed to an education which simply turns you out so that you can make a lot of money and which doesn't care what it does to you as a human being. They're opposed to people being poor, whether they're white or black, and to the incredible waste they see around them in the economic organization of the country. They're opposed to the use of violence abroad in the international arena by our country and by other countries. And so they know that something more must be done beyond desegregation. And they're groping their way towards this something more, beginning to think about it. And in this, I think there's a great deal of hope.
There are many deep problems in Mississippi that go beyond or that are intimately tied up with the problem of black and white. And how can a movement which is basically oriented toward a racial prejudice hope to be successful in the context of a society that has these other problems which exacerbate the black-white?
I guess it won't be successful unless it begins working on some of these other problems, unless it begins thinking about them and developing methods of dealing with them. I think that the SNCC tactics, I think that the idea of demonstration, and the idea of setting up yardsticks. By yardsticks, I mean the kind of thing that Roosevelt meant with the TVA, where he said you set something up which is a model, and you force everybody else to follow it. If you don't like the way the educational system runs, you set up your own school. You call it a freedom school, If you don't like the way voter registration is going, you register your own voters. If you don't like the way a legislature is running, they haven't done this yet, but it might be done, set up your own legislature. We did this during the Revolutionary War, of course, and perhaps, then this kind of movement, which now is just a civil rights movement, might become a broader one, a more encompassing one.
I do not know if Howard Zinn is right, that the leaders of SNCC and the other civil rights organizations have thought beyond desegregation. I am not sure whether or not his suggestions are either good or useful ones. Such questions go beyond the summer of 1964 and beyond the civil rights movement in Mississippi. But that movement, and the summer that we have focused on for the past 12 weeks, raised these questions more vividly than they had been raised before, perhaps. And they are questions for all of us as a nation, black and white, Northerner and Southerner.
Thursday gave me a little more grace. Friday told me to watch and pray. Saturday told me what to say. Sunday gave me the power divine. I'll let my little light shine. Oh, this little light of mine, Lord.
This has been part 12 of This Little Light, a series of documentaries on Mississippi in 1964. The programs were produced from field recordings made in Mississippi by Chris Koch, Dale Miner, and Dave Welch. Production assistants were Willie Ross and Kathy Dopkin. The programs were written and produced by Chris Koch for Pacifica Radio.